All right, let's go ahead and finish this, this exercise and answer any questions that you might have about this flexible compound components thing. So I'm going to bring in the exercise version of the tests, or the usage for the tests, and run these tests, and we've got this siren thing that's saying the switch component's not getting past the right props. And we learned that's because this React children map, which is responsible for cloning these children and providing those props, can only be applied to the immediate children, not descendants of those children. So that's why the switch component isn't getting the right props. So let's go ahead and make that happen. The first thing that we're going to do, as indicated by Cody the koala bear, is we'll make our toggle context. React create context. And here, this is going to be our default value for context. So if a consumer is rendered not within a provider, then this is the value that consumer will receive. Okay, and so here we have this theme context example. We're passing light as a string, and that's the value that this consumer will receive if it's not rendered within a provider which provides any other value. So for us, I want to provide on as false, and because the button needs to get access to toggle, I need to also provide a toggle function, and that will just do a no-op function. We could do some sort of validation or something in there as well, just to say, hey, you're rendering outside or something like that. But in our case, we're good with just a no-op function here. And then we're going to use the toggle context in our render method with return toggle context.provider. The value is going to be this .state. And I'll explain why. So actually here, I'll explain that later. Let's make the value be this first. And then we'll just pass in this .props.children. And we can get rid of all this stuff. Okay, still stuff is not working. We're not even providing it to on and off right now. Because no longer do they need to know or to get those from props. They will actually get all of that information from context. So I'm going to do this fancy thing, just to get all this stuff done at once. So we'll say toggle context.consumer, and this is going to accept a function that is context value, and that will return this value, and then we'll close off toggle context.consumer. Save that and thank our lucky stars for prettier. And then instead of getting on from our props, we're going to pull it from the context value. And we'll do that here also. Remove this. And then here, we'll just rename this whole thing to props. And we'll do context value.on and context value.toggle. Okay, and everything is passing. So there's one more thing that I want to show about this, but before we do that, does anyone have any questions so far?
It seems like the defaults being given to context just like hide problems, basically.
Yes.
Like you should never try to render.
Right, yeah. So there are some situations in like context APIs, like this one, for example, where it doesn't make any sense to not have the provider. And in fact, the way that we would actually expose this is I'd probably put all of this in one file, and then I'd only expose the toggle component itself. And so it would actually be impossible to use these components. Well, actually, sorry, no, not impossible. I just do this, and now poof, I've broken everything. So yeah, I guess there may be a solution in the context API to say this is required. I know with the old version of the API, you use prop types, and you could say that context was required. I haven't actually looked into that to see if that's possible with the new API. But you could definitely in userland, you could do that where you'd say inside of here, like make the default something like no default or something like that. So yeah, I feel like there are several other ways that you could do that. Good question. Other questions? Okay, one person in the chat asked, just kind of for confirmation, would you put all of this in one file and then expose toggle context for people to use? Normally that's similar to something that I would do. I generally, if I'm making a reusable component, I'm exposing context. I'm going to expose the provider or the consumer, as the case may be, not the entire context object. I like to have more control over it. Later we'll be doing something like this, static consumer, just to make things a little more explicit. In our case, we don't need to expose that. And this is kind of a key point to the Compound Components API, is that the state that's being shared between these components is all implicit state. So the user of these components doesn't actually see any of the state that's being shared between these components. And that's the general idea behind the Compound Components API. And when you know that you have a use case that's suited for compound components is when you have several components that need to share state, but the user doesn't need to know about that. Okay? Cool. So there's one other problem with this, and that is with the context API, anytime this value changes to something else, a different reference to a different object or anything else like that, then it's going to re-render itself as well as all of the consumers. And as we know, the render method can be called like many, many times and never actually change what the user is seeing, at least in many parts of the React tree. And so by making this an object that we declare inside the render method, the value is changing every single time it's rendered. And so every single time this is rendered, all of the consumers will also be re-rendered. And so that could potentially be a performance problem. And so in general, I try to avoid doing this. And instead, what I do is I pass to do this dot state. And this dot state will is an object that doesn't change until things actually have changed. Like I'm calling set state or something, so it makes a lot of sense. The thing that doesn't really make a lot of sense is, to be able to provide the toggle, I actually have to add it to my state. Here, actually, let me put that back where it was. And that feels weird to me because it's a function in state. It's like odd. But you get used to it because it's the best way to do this. And maybe in the future, the React team will figure out a different way to accomplish this. But in conversations on Twitter with smart people, this was where we landed on how to do this. So one thing that you might have noticed if you did do this is you're going to get an error. And this is because the way that class properties work, these are executed in order during the construction phase. And so at the time that state is initialized, that should be toggle. This dot toggle does not actually exist. It hasn't been initialized yet. It's coming after. That's why you have to move it down. Oops. And then everything is working. Does that piece make sense? You can imagine this being inside of the constructor function and this dot in front of all these, if that is helpful. Okay, I think there's a question in the chat. Yeah, so if you're still using, so somebody's asking about the constructor function. Oh, constructor. So this is the default constructor function, args, super args. This is, if you don't provide a constructor, this is the constructor that is provided for you. And so in our case, we could actually move all of this here, put this dot in front of these, and that's identical to what we had already in the first place. It's more code, so I don't like it. At least it's more code that doesn't provide any more clarity, and so I don't like it. And so I get rid of this stuff and just not use the constructor. I pretty much never use a constructor, like almost all the time, because I can accomplish my purposes like this. Coolio. Any other questions before we jump into the next one? Okay, so for this next one, we're actually going to, yeah, question. Feedback. Oh, thank you. I'm going to give you a high five at lunch. Yeah, so let's go ahead and fill out your elaboration, write down what you learned, and then update your test to say you submitted. And again, if you're tired of typing your email in every time, you can just do node scripts autofill email feedback. It'll ask for your email address and pre-fill all those for you. Isn't code so cool that we could do that? I'm using like a million modules to accomplish this simple task, but the fact that I could do that is pretty cool.